The oil produced from this wellhead first travels to this treating facility, and then to this tank, where it's gathered and stored for shipment in the pipeline. But before the oil is ready for pipeline shipment, it must be tested for quality and measured for quantity. And this testing and measuring process is the job of the gauger. Although there are many steps in the gauger's routine, he has two goals to accomplish while working a lease tank. The first goal is to determine how much sediment and water, or S&W, is in the tank oil. S&W is very undesirable to have in oil, primarily because it is not a marketable product. Most leases produce at least some S&W, so the percentage of S&W contained in the tank oil is of vital importance to the lease company, the pipeline company, and hence the gauger. We'll be talking a lot about S&W in this program, but for right now, all you need to know is what S&W stands for, and that there are two types of S&W, settled and suspended. Settled S&W forms a layer on the bottom of the tank and is often referred to as tank bottom. Suspended S&W remains trapped in the bulk of the tank oil and can only be seen after being chemically or physically separated from the oil. The second major goal of the gauger is precise measurement of volume. He measures how much fluid is stored in the tank, transfers or runs almost all the tank into the pipeline, and then measures the remaining fluid in the tank. So let's take a look at the tools a gauger uses to test and run a tank. And to start, specifically those used to determine the S&W content. One of the first tools a gauger needs for S&W testing is a sampling device like this core thief. Most core thieves are the trap type, which means they have a rotating valve at the bottom that acts like a trap door. First, open the rotating valve. This makes the thief a hollow tube that passes through the oil with a minimum of disturbance. The rotating valve can be closed at any depth in the oil by means of a trip release attached to the thief line. Once the thief is lowered to the correct depth, a sharp tug on the line will trip the valve closed. The thief is then retrieved with the oil sample enclosed. Or, for tank bottom samples, the gauger can extend the trip rod on the bottom of the thief. When the trip rod bumps the tank bottom, the rotating valve closes. Once all the oil samples are retrieved, the gauger will eventually put a small representative portion of the tank oil in a centrifuge tube for testing. Centrifuge tubes are used to run the oil samples in a centrifuge. Tubes come in a variety of forms. There are 100 milliliter tubes, 200-part tubes, as well as 12.5 milliliter tubes and pear-shaped tubes. Regardless which is used, the tube should be clean and free of dirt and water. The gauger dilutes the oil sample with solvent before it's tested. The solvent must be clean and water-saturated according to the API Manual of Petroleum Measurement Standards, Chapter 10, Section 4. After dilution, the tube is placed in a preheating unit or the centrifuge preheater for warming, and a pocket thermometer verifies the sample has reached the proper test temperature. Once the samples are heated, they're placed in the centrifuge. The suspended S&W in the oil is separated from the oil by applying centrifugal force. Since S&W is heavier than oil, any suspended S&W in the oil sample will be forced down to the tip of the tube. Now let's look at the tools the gauger uses to measure volume. To start, he first determines the API gravity of the stored petroleum by using a hydrometer. Check the hydrometer for defects such as detached API gravity scales, mercury column separation in the thermometer, and loose shot in the tip. Since temperature affects the volume of the stored petroleum, the gauger also needs a clean, approved cup case thermometer to lower into the tank oil. To measure the depth of the oil stored in the tank, the gauger uses a flexible steel measuring tape graduated every 1/8 inch and fitted with a brass bob. The tape must be clean so the oil will leave a clean cut or mark on the tape for easy reading. In addition, the gauger carries a small notepad and pencil to notate his measurements and a rag to clean his hands and oil spillage. Now that we've looked at the basic tools, let's look at the tank. The typical lease tank consists of a metal shell with a vent and drain, an inlet line to allow oil from the treating facility to flow into the tank for storage, a hatch through which the gauger measures and samples the oil, a pipeline connection or tank outlet line at the bottom of the tank, and often an equalizer line that connects and equalizes the liquid level of all the connected tanks in the battery. Now that we've oriented ourselves to what we're going to be working on and with, let's walk through the gauging, testing, and running process step by step. When you first arrive at the tank site, take time to inspect the general condition of the tank. Make note of any distortions, leaky seams, or connections. If there are any questionable conditions, play it safe. A gauger spends a lot of time alone, and it may be a long time before someone wanders by if you are injured. As you walk around the tank, check that all bottom connected valves are closed, and that the tank outlet connection has remained closed and sealed since the last tank run. A seal is used for security purposes and is attached to the valve in such a way that any valve movement will break it. The seal itself is usually a numbered boxcar snap type seal, a numbered lead seal with a wire dart, or occasionally a padlock and chain. Once the bottom valves are closed, write down the tank identification number and the maximum fill level, both of which are stenciled right on the side of the tank. Note the height of the outlet connection and of the equalizer line if one is in use. Put all the tools in a carry case to save time, and before leaving the truck, switch on the centrifuge heater or preheating unit so it can be warming while you perform your other duties. As you climb the tank steps, be sure to hold the handrail. This prevents falling on water or oil slick treads and bleeds off any static electricity which might ignite tank vapors when the hatch is opened. Once on top of the tank, verify all top valves are closed, including the valve on the equalizer line. Once all the valves leading to and from the tank are closed, the tank is isolated and ready to work. If the tank contains sour crude, be sure you wear all the proper breathing equipment or take the necessary precautions. Place your body upwind and turn your face away as you open the hatch. Next, look at the oil surface. If it's boiling or agitated, the chances are that the tank was recently filled or rolled. Do not work a tank in this condition. Agitated oil stirs up the settled S&W, giving inaccurate test results. Wait until the tank settles and the surface is still before working the tank. Notice that the size of the hatch restricts access to only a small portion of the stored oil. The gauger is limited to working with a small column of oil. For this reason, the oil samples must be taken in a specific order, starting at the top of the oil column and working down. Otherwise, the movement of the thief stirs the settled S&W, contaminates the upper oil samples, and gives inaccurate test results. First, take the oil thief and set the rotating valve to the open position and attach the trip. Lower the thief to the desired level, trip the rotating valve, and withdraw the thief from the tank. According to the API Manual of Petroleum Measurement Standards, the level, as well as the number of samples, varies with the size of the tank. For tanks holding 1,000 barrels or less, only one sample is needed. Draw the sample midway between the surface of the oil and the bottom of the outlet connection. For tanks holding 1,000 barrels or more, and having a depth of between 10 and 15 feet, a two-way sample is required. The upper sample is drawn at midpoint in the upper third of the tank content, and the lower sample is drawn at midpoint in the lower third of the tank content. For tanks holding 1,000 barrels or more, and having a depth of 15 feet or more, a three-way sample is required. The top sample is taken with the top of the thief 6 inches below the surface of the oil. The middle sample is drawn at the tank contents midpoint, and the outlet sample is taken with the bottom of the thief level with the bottom of the outlet connection. As the samples are drawn in the proper order, the gauger may handle them in different ways, depending on company policy. One way is to collect all the samples in a sample container, mix the contents, then draw off a representative portion for testing. A second way to handle the oil samples is to draw off a small amount of each sample with a metal syringe and place it directly in the centrifuge tube until it is half full with samples of tank oil. Regardless of which method is used, a representative portion of tank oil must be used for both the hydrometer test and the centrifuge test. Fill the thief with oil representative of the entire tank and place it in a vertical position. Then insert the hydrometer so that it floats freely throughout the hydrometer test. For high viscosity oils, a slight spin of the hydrometer will help bring it to rest. Look at the oil surface around the hydrometer. If bubbles form, remove them with a piece of paper so they won't affect your reading. Depress the free-floating hydrometer just 2 scale divisions and release. Do not depress more than 2 divisions, or the weight of the oil on the hydrometer stem will affect the reading. The hydrometer should immediately return to its previous position. If it doesn't, the oil is too thick to test and usually needs to be heated. The API Manual of Petroleum Measurement Standards, Chapter 9, Section 1, has a table listing limiting conditions and test temperatures for a variety of crude sample types. Allow sufficient time for the hydrometer to come to rest, usually about 5 minutes, and for all the air bubbles to come to the surface. While you're waiting on the hydrometer, you can position the cup case thermometer for the tank oil temperature reading. Since the tank shell might be hotter or colder than the bulk of the oil, obtain your readings at least 12 inches or more from the shell. Temperature readings, like sampling, depend on the size of the tank. According to API Petroleum Measurement Standards, if the oil level is less than 10 feet, or under 5,000 barrels, 1 temperature reading is sufficient. If the tank holds 5,000 barrels or more, and the level is between 10 and 15 feet, 2 readings are taken. The first 3 feet below the surface, the second 3 feet from the bottom of the tank. If the tank holds 5,000 barrels or more, and the level is 15 feet or more, take 3 temperature readings. The first 3 feet below the surface, the second at midpoint, and the third 3 feet from the bottom. Leave the thermometer at least 5 minutes for each reading. By the time the cup case thermometer is in place for the first reading, it should be time to check the hydrometer. Shield the hydrometer from the wind and place your eye slightly above the plane of the oil surface. Notice that the oil creeps upward where it comes in contact with the hydrometer stem. This is called the meniscus and is caused by the surface tension of the oil. Read the scale to the nearest tenth of a degree at the top of the meniscus, then subtract 1/10 of a degree. The remainder is recorded as the observed API gravity of the oil. Now, withdraw the instrument just enough to expose the thermometer scale without letting the tip of the hydrometer leave the oil. Read and record the observed temperature to the nearest whole degree Fahrenheit. The gauger's next step is to measure the tank's settled S&W. As crude oil sits in storage, water and sediment, which are heavier than the oil, will settle out and form a layer on the bottom of the tank. Since this layer is mostly just trash, the gauger doesn't want to ship it as oil in the pipeline. So he measures the height of this layer and makes sure that the top of the settled S&W is at least 4 inches below the outlet connection. There are several ways to test the height of the settled S&W. The first method is by using the thief. Begin by extending the trip rod if necessary and opening the rotating valve. Then lower the thief slowly into the tank and allow it to rest on the bottom in vertical position. Raise it a little from the tank bottom and lower it with enough force to trip the rotating valve closed. However, do not drop the oil thief. Doing so might cause a splash on the bottom, which would give an erroneous reading. Take care not to tip the thief from its vertical position and keep the line taut. Withdraw the thief and slowly pour its contents back into the tank until, by observation, feel, or both, it's evident that the remaining contents are tank bottom. Yellow streaks, change in oil color, and water globules indicate settled S&W. Return the thief to an upright position and note the height of the remaining sample. If the trip rod was extended, that distance must be added to the sample height in the thief. The sum will be the height of the settled S&W in the tank. Subtract the S&W level from the height of the outlet connection. If the difference is less than 4 inches, notify the operator to reduce the level of the settled S&W before running the tank. The second method for determining settled S&W is the sample cod, located 4 inches below the outlet connection. Open and flush the cod. If good oil is observed, the clearance is adequate to run the tank. The third method of determining the settled S&W is the use of water-cut paste. This paste is used in light-colored crudes of high gravity with settled bottoms composed mostly of free water. Apply the paste to the lower portion of the gauge tape and bob. Once the bob is lowered into the tank, it takes at least 1 minute or longer for water to either dissolve or turn the paste red. Read and record the dissolved or red portion of the tape to the nearest 1/4 inch. Regardless of which method you use, considerable technique is required for measuring the settled S&W. In many cases, the true level is difficult to obtain, but the best determination must be made. The gauger's next step is gauging, or measuring the oil height in the tank. For this, he again uses the steel measuring tape fitted with a brass bob. Clean the tape to get a good reading, and for very light crudes, you may need to apply a thin coat of gauging paste in order to see the cut of the oil. Now, locate the gauge point on the hatch. It's usually indicated by a stencil, groove, or clip, and all measurements must be taken from this point. The bottom of the tank is not necessarily level or free from obstructions, and by using the gauge point, the bob strikes exactly the same place on the tank's bottom each time. When lowering the gauge line, keep the metal tape in contact with the hatch to prevent static electrical charges from accumulating and igniting the tank vapors. Lower the bob carefully, and touch bottom so lightly that the bob does not deviate from the vertical position at any time. Note the tape measurement where it strikes the hatch, and compare this to the gauge height stenciled on the tank. The two readings should be the same. If not, the bob may be resting on an obstruction. Retrieve the tape and note where the oil level cut or marked the tape. Now, just to check your reading, gauge the tank again. Always gauge the tank twice to double-check the gauge reading. The readings from both gauges should be the same. For tanks 1,000 barrels or smaller, report gauges to the nearest 1/4 inch. For tanks over 1,000 barrels, report gauges to the nearest 1/8 inch. This first gauge is recorded on the run ticket as the opening gauge. Later, after running the tank, it will be gauged again for the closing gauge. Now, remember that tank thermometer? Retrieve it and read it as soon as it's pulled from the tank, without spilling oil from the cup. Read it to the nearest whole degree Fahrenheit, and then repeat the process the required number of times for the tank size. For multiple readings, record the average of all the temperatures to the nearest whole degree. In high viscosity oils, it takes longer for a stationary thermometer to reach oil temperature. Raising and lowering the thermometer through 1 foot of oil at the required depth will speed up the thermometer's adjustment to oil temperature. Next, pick up all the equipment, clean the instruments, secure the hatch, wipe the tank of any spillage, and return to the truck with a representative tank oil sample to run the centrifuge test. By now, the preheater should be warm enough to test the oil for suspended S&W. Start with 2 clean centrifuge tubes filled to the 50 milliliter or 100 part mark with oil sample. Then, add an equal portion of solvent. Stopper the tubes and shake. Shaking the tube builds up pressure, so keep the tube well below face and eye level. Place the tubes in the preheater and warm to 120 degrees Fahrenheit unless you're running samples of waxy crudes. Waxy crudes need to be heated to 140 degrees and cannot drop below 115 degrees during the centrifuge test. Otherwise, solidified wax will be forced to the bottom of the tube and will show incorrectly as S&W. Also, certain crudes may need the addition of a demulsifier in order to separate the S&W. Once the samples reach the required temperature, place one tube in the centrifuge. Then, place the other filled tube opposite the first to act as a balance. Close and secure the centrifuge bowl lid and bring the centrifuge up to test speed. If the centrifuge sounds sluggish or slower than normal, check the speed for accuracy immediately. The sample should revolve at a rate of 1500 RPM for 3 to 10 minutes, depending on the character of the sample. At the end of the test, turn off the centrifuge and allow it to come to a stop all by itself. Do not squeeze the centrifuge hub for a braking action, because this practice often results in hand injury. Remove the sample and read the volume of S&W in the bottom. Do so very carefully and do not agitate the contents. Read and note the level of S&W. Then, repeat the centrifuge process until 2 consecutive runs are made with the same levels. If this comparison becomes critical, refer to the API Manual of Petroleum Measurement Standards, Chapter 10, Section 4. If you are using 100 milliliter, 12.5 milliliter, or pear-shaped tubes, add the readings from the 2 tubes and enter the total on the run ticket as volume percentage. If you used 200-part tubes, read the tubes separately and average the readings. Then enter the average as volume percentage. Finally, dispose of all samples in a suitable container, clean the tubes immediately, and turn off the centrifuge heater. Now, compare the test results with the acceptable S&W limits set by the pipeline carrier. If the suspended S&W exceeds those limits, do not run the tank without permission. If the S&W percentage is within limits, the tank can be prepared for shipment in the pipeline. To do this, check again that all tank connections are closed and sealed. When the tank is isolated, break the seal on the pipeline outlet connection and open the valve. The tank is now running. Record the broken seal number on the run ticket. Often, recording broken and replacement outlet seal numbers is a state or federal regulation, but almost always it's a matter of record on the run ticket. Other seals may be entered on the gauger's seal record as well. After running the tank oil into the pipeline, the tank is considered out, or at low gauge. Close the pipeline outlet connection, seal it, and record the seal number. Next, measure how much settled S&W is still in the tank, following the same procedure as before, and record your findings. Then, measure how much fluid is left in the tank for the closing gauge, and enter this level on the run ticket. Also, if the tank is larger than 1,000 barrels nominal capacity, obtain a closing tank temperature. In some cases, a closing temperature is required for smaller tanks, but you'll be notified of these special cases. Then, prepare the tank to fill again by removing the seals or locks from the inlet valve and equalizer valve. Use tin snips to remove the seals, not a pocket knife. Finally, check over the run ticket to make sure everything is filled in neatly and legibly. Some gaugers fill out the ticket as they go. Others make notes to be transferred later. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as it's written down. The run ticket affects company income, royalty payments, and allowables, so it's very important, and the figures should never be trusted to memory. Never sign a run ticket unless you have participated or witnessed the work performed. Likewise, never delegate your work to someone else. In addition, comply with all government regulations and company requirements, and don't rush your work. Sacrifice speed for accuracy. Now, the only thing left for you to do is to clean, check, and pack the equipment. Once that's done, you're through with this lease. Until next time.